Let's create a pivotal impact. Friends in the industry. One of the greatest aspects of the transportation industry, I personally believe, is the people, and the people that are obviously working within the industry. So millions and millions of people work directly and indirectly in our industry. Some realize it, and honestly, some don't. But as people, it's crucial we understand we have a choice on how we respond to stressful situations, and especially when you can't avoid the situation altogether. So in today's episode, I'm really excited to speak with Rita Smith, the owner of Road Warrior News, honestly, a true industry advocate. During our conversation, we dive into what is stress and highlight the current stresses in the transportation industry, while Rita shares practical advice of how we can navigate through situations that we can't always get out of. Rita's journey over the last 30 plus years is amazing. And I believe you're going to receive so much value from our conversation today. So I highly recommend you visit roadwarriornews.com to learn more, as well as contact Rita directly at roadwarriornews@rogers.com. So if this is the first time you've ever checked out a Truck Focus podcast, I welcome you to our community, and to all of our dedicated listeners, I just wanted to say thanks again for just your investment of time and all of the support. So make sure you like this episode, subscribe to the channel you're listening to, and share it out, because I really do believe that all the advice that Rita shares today is super impactful. So let's get this conversation started. Rita, honestly, welcome to the Truck Focus podcast. I'm super excited for our conversation today on a number of reasons. First off, something that we were actually just talking about before we hit record, and I've really admired for the long enough but short enough time that we've known each other, is you're really phenomenal in the advocacy space, and you're not full of I thinks. You're really factual, which I think really solidifies what you're saying. And I'm honored that you've taken the time, obviously, to join me on the podcast. I'm excited to dive into your journey. I'm excited to talk about Road Warrior News. And we're also going to highlight stress. Obviously, there's some stressful events happening in the transportation industry. And the fact
just a little, do you think?
Yeah, and it's just impressive how your training, but also your real life experience and how you navigate through stress, I think can really help myself, but can really help our listener base just navigate through these difficult times where we've never been through this type of, I'd say, level of stress with so many different mandates coming in and whatnot. So I just think our timing for the interview is awesome. So yeah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Josh. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation as well. And I have to tip my hat to you. I want to give you a sincere compliment before we get started, which is to say the level of preparation that you're putting into these interviews and conversations is commendable, really admirable. I have done a lot of tape recorded or online talks or podcasts or interviews that are way less prepared. You are one of the more prepared individuals that I'm working with, and I think that shows in your content. So congratulations! Don't stop doing the background work.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's important that I give you a platform where, as a leader and as someone that I want to uplift, you just feel comfortable to succeed in the environment. So I appreciate the compliment. Thank you very much.
Right. Enough of the compliments. Enough of the Sammy Maudlin Mutual Admiration Show. Let's get into the stress.
No doubt. Okay, so let's walk us through who is Rita Smith and share a little bit about your backstory in the transportation industry, but also you have so many cool experiences as a writer. So can you talk about both of those?
Oh, I would be so happy to. And actually, my experiences as a writer and in transportation dovetail. Right from the very first days of my writing career, which were like 37 years ago now, back in 1985, I really cut my teeth learning how to write for a small trade publication in Toronto called Taxi News. It's a newspaper for cab drivers and about cab drivers. It was published by a man who ran a taxi company in Toronto and who got really fed up with the way the city, it was Metro Toronto at the time, treated the taxi industry and the drivers. The laws seemed kind of arbitrary, and they were working against quality and quality of life for people in the industry. So he launched this publication. I went to work for it from its very earliest issues, and it was kind of a match made in heaven. They loved my sense of humor. Peter loved it. The readers loved it. They loved my sense of humor. And I really appreciated the drivers. I just thought they were the cat's pajamas. They were funny. They were almost always doing something besides taxi driving. They were writers, they were musicians, they were artists, they were teachers, one was a physicist, lots of doctors and people from other places. So I found like an unlimited number of really interesting human beings to talk to me and share their story. So I started at Taxi News. That was 36 years ago or 37 years ago now. In the intervening years, I got picked up, I got noticed and hired very quickly, let's say recruited, not indoctrinated, but recruited by advertising and marketing firms and then politicians. Politicians found me right away from among my very first efforts writing at Taxi News. The next person I met, the publisher of Taxi News, introduced me to a liberal politician and said, he needs you to write some stuff for him. So right from the very beginning of my writing, I was writing in the transportation and the taxi driving field. It was a blast. There were great times in the city of Toronto. Then I got co-opted or requested. It was really an honor. From a cabinet minister who was my mayor, asked me if I would come to be his press secretary at Queen's Park. I've also been to Ottawa, where I was director of communications for the Minister of Health. And like I've been writing constantly, persuasion, propaganda, factual research, large journalistic research pieces. I've been writing for 37 years now. I've been writing for 37 years now, since 1985. And never did I ever lose my connection to Taxi News. Nice. Through all of government, I was writing humor pieces for them. And then when I left my government job in Ottawa, the Toronto Taxi Alliance asked me if I would come and run their organization. And I happened to be there, Josh, just as Uber was hitting the scene.
Wow. Okay.
Oh, don't.
Wow.
Oh, it's too much to talk about.
Fighting words.
So I was with the TTA before Uber hit Toronto in its full-blown illegality and contravention of every law that existed they were allowed to break, but we'll talk about that in more detail later. And actually how that's coming to the trucking industry too, right?
Yes.
And where these things dovetail. So I was in Toronto working with the industry before Uber came. I was there when Uber came. It was a nightmare. It's just a nightmare. It remains a nightmare. And in the 2 years ago, I knew that the publisher of Taxi News, what's the phrase where you call it? My mothership, yes. Taxi News. The publisher was in his 70s and his wife was nagging him to retire. So I offered to buy Taxi News. And because he was a busy guy and he had more important things to do, I guess, it took a while for us to get it nailed down, right? So although I offered to buy Taxi News in 2019, I didn't actually complete the purchase of the newspaper until 2021. July of 2021, I bought Taxi News. I own it now.
Nice. Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm really proud to say that. Really, the paper is 36 years old now, Taxi News since 1985. And it's always been an admired small trade publication for the honesty and the fearlessness with which it wrote, and the fact that it was not afraid to fly in the face of government or industry, or it's a pretty am I allowed to say ballsy? A pretty ballsy.
Yes, yeah.
So I'm proud to own it. During that 2 year period, while I was waiting to take ownership of Taxi News and get the URL and be able to start publishing Taxi News, I noticed that a lot of the same issues and realities, economic and otherwise, that were really damaging the taxi industry were creeping into trucking. Like I noticed that Trucking Inc., Drivers Inc. business model, and some of the other things that the focus on autonomous, which just we'll talk about that. It makes me laugh. But the business models where savings are going to be found, and they're almost always found on the backs of drivers. Wow, are there savings anywhere else? Let's talk about that. The idea that that business model was moving over into trucking from taxi, which had been annihilated by it, caught my interest. And so while I was waiting for the purchase of Taxi News to go through, I started covering trucking. I started looking around, talking to some of my Carnegie graduates who work in the trucking industry, looking at the stories that needed to be covered well in advance of this week's debacle, that's for sure. So I started writing about things I saw and commonalities that I saw in the trucking industry that I had been aware of for many years in the taxi industry. I'm still doing that. Like, that's still a big focus and feature of what I'm doing right now, is to say, wow, hey, you guys, heads up, warning. What did the robot used to say on that space show? Danger, alert,
yes,
alert,
yeah.
danger, alert. So
yes.
I kind of feel a little bit like that robot with my arms, my slinky arms going back and forth, going danger, alert, danger, danger. So then they merged, and I launched the website of roadwarriornews.com, which incorporates taxi news since 1985. I'm also covering, to a lesser degree, because there's just so many hours in a week, I'm delivery courier and ride hailing, right? I'm actually
wow.
Yeah. So basically, Josh, professional drivers, right?
Yes.
People who drive for a living, various business models. Some are independent owner operators, some are employees, some are, have the app tattooed on their forehead or on the inside of their eyelids. The courier companies, since COVID came in, are just enormous, right? Like the increase in their business has been exponential.
Yep.
And still using lots of owner operators, though, right? Where all the risk is with the driver and all the profits with the company. Well, we can talk about that. So that brings us up to today. And as luck would have it, or as not luck, as chance would have it, in the last couple of weeks, I've been just 100% all in on truckers at the border. And which highlights all of these other things that we're talking about, right? Which highlights all the challenges that Peter Zahakis saw for the taxi industry in 1985. Who's responsible? Who eats the cost? How do you protect the drivers? How does a company that's taking risks under a certain government regulatory framework continue to make profit when that framework just changes instantly without notice? So all of those elements that I started off covering in the taxi industry in 1985, I see across the board and to a much larger and more significant degree in the trucking industry now. So hopefully I hope that I'm doing a good enough job trying to be balanced, trying to be fair, trying to talk to as many people in the industry as I possibly can, trying not to swallow the government line when the government line is not honest, and get those stories out there to the people in the industry and in all the industries. It sort of seems as though that is occurring because the website hits this week have been phenomenal. The stories are getting shared and retweeted, and website visits have been through the roof. So I think that there's a need for clear, honest, not sugar-coated information for professional drivers.
Correct.
Holy God, how long did that take?
No, and I think you hit so many points on the head, because if we look at your journey, and I, you can't see me right now, but I do a lot of smiling and nodding my head in agreement, because I'm like, yes. So a couple of things that really stand out is I honestly believe that if we can use the term superpower, is your superpower honestly is to make a difference, because you're not afraid to speak on behalf of people. And I think that's where you can be the best industry advocate in whatever industry you're in until there's something in your face challenging it. And I think that's when true heroes have the opportunity to rise. or people just, oh, who am I, imposter syndrome, and then they just kind of go quiet. So year after year after year after year, like the taxi industry, obviously professional drivers in that space, to the corruption. And again, we don't want to have to go too far into that, as well as I like the fact that you were able to merge it into with professional drivers that are operating, say, an 18-wheeler to the courier industry. You're very consistent on showing up and being an advocate. So I think that's a superpower that we need to recognize. And it's also a call to action. So if you're listening to this right now, or you're reading the content that I love reading your articles, and if you have something to say, you have a concern, I'd highly recommend reaching out to Rita. So obviously we'll name drop that here in a moment. We're going to include her contact information in the show notes, of course, but highly recommend that if you're like, hey, what is this, or how does this work, what's going on here, reach out to Rita, because as she just proved, she has years of experience actually backing it up. So I think that's one of your best traits, Rita. But also it's cool. So you mentioned the physicists as and the various professions outside of quote unquote operating as a taxi driver. I remember when that was my second job at the time, and a pizza delivery guy, they migrated to Canada from the Soviet Union, and he was a physicist back home. Now he's at the time, when this was a handful of years ago. And I was like, you're a what? And it had something to do with the math and something to do with the space and all this stuff. And that was my first realization that, okay, a job title is just a job title. It's irrelevant. It's the person that matters. So I think in our industry, especially in the transportation 18-wheeler space, there's a lot of newer Canadians in this space, where different reasons to come to Canada. We welcome them with open arms, because ultimately it's like we all bring something to the table. And like I know people that they used to control airports. I know people that, they were doctors in different places, and then it's just not transferable trades, I guess, because of the different countries. So what can you do where you're still independent? Okay. But then, as you mentioned, there's so many different barriers that professional drivers have to overcome: the borders, the vaccines, all of these changing mandates, to what is this and this isn't working. Like, there's a lot there. So I'm excited to really dive into the quote unquote stress of our industry, because this is another area where you thrive in. So can you, I guess, highlight first off, what is stress? And in your very educated and well-researched opinion, what's the stress level of the transportation industry right now, do you think?
You know what? I was preparing for that question in advance of this interview. And here's one of the really important to each individual person listening. This is a really important point, okay? My quick definition of stress is that stress is, and this is sort of my Dale Carnegie mental health first aid volunteer person who I'm not a professional, I'm not a psychologist, I'm none of those things, but we'll talk a little bit about how stress finds me, and mental health issues find me too, which is why I've taken as much training as I have. So stress is something that demands a response from you, okay? That would be the quickest definition of stress. If a person or a situation, a piece of information, some life event requires a response from you, right? Demands a response. That's stressful. There's positive stress and there's negative stress. As people like to point out, getting a promotion is stressful. Getting married is stressful. Buying a new house is stressful. Mm-hmm. Starting a new job is stressful. Most people would consider that to be good news, but it's still stressful, right? It's still stressful. Yes. It demands a response from you. You have to change. You have to act. You have to think differently. You have to become responsible for a whole new situation. So anything that demands a response from you is stressful. So then you get into the situations where the control of the situation is internal with you or external, let's say with a border guard, okay? You cannot always be in control of things that stress you. You can decide whether or not to take a new job, or decide whether or not to get married or buy a new house, but you don't get to decide, truckers now have to show vaccine passports at the border. That's not your decision. Mm-hmm. What is your decision in a stressful situation is how you approach it, your attitude in dealing with that stress. That is not an industry-wide response. That's a person. That's you, Josh. That's me, Rita. What goes on between our ears, in our minds when we look at a stressful situation. will determine how stressful we find that situation, right? So I really want to talk about, there's lots of tools and techniques and things that you can use to manage stressful situations. I get into detail on some of that. The main thing that I would like your listeners to keep in mind now and always is you might not get to choose. You don't get to choose. You won't get to choose every situation that you're in, but you get to choose your attitude. Okay. You get to choose your thinking. Would you agree?
Yes, 1,000%. Yeah.
So the analogy I used to use with my classes, which I think people to this day have found really helpful, because I know people will send me surfing pictures every now and then. Somebody that graduated 10 years ago will send me a photo to say, I was thinking of you today, is a surfer standing on a beach, a person standing on a beach. If you are standing on the shoreline of the ocean and you're watching a wave come barreling straight at you, a big one, 40 or 50 or 90 feet high wave is bearing down upon you as you stand on the beach, and you don't know how to swim, your response is going to be panic, right? You go, oh my God, we're going to drown. It's a tsunami. We're all going to drown. It's the end. Oh no. If you don't know how to swim and you're watching a wave come bearing down upon you. A surfer, on the other hand, a surfer who's been waiting all year for this wave, who's in a wetsuit with a surfboard under his arm, looks at the exact same wave and goes, cowabunga, this is awesome. I've been waiting all year for this. And they don't just stand there on the beach waiting for the wave to knock them over and drown them. They run out to meet it, right? They run out to meet it. They bend the laws of physics to their will. They're up on their board. They're hanging five. They're having a blast, like the best time they've ever had, with the exact same wave, right? It's the exact same wave. The wave is not what determines the stress or the lack of stress even the enthusiasm in the situation. What determines the level of stress is what goes on inside the minds of those two people, right?
Yes.
Does that sound like a fair analogy to you? Okay.
Yes.
So in any industry where people are working, there is stress and more stress. Some of it people have control of, and some of it they don't. But the successful people that I talk to in any industry, and it's really fun to see the difference between taxi drivers and truck drivers. The successful people who've lasted the years, they're not in their first year on the job. They're not in their 15th year on the job. They've been doing it 30 or 40 years. They're still making a good living. They're still safe after all this time. The words that come out of their mouth are phenomenally wise. I could write a whole book just on the things I've learned from cab drivers and the things I'm learning from truckers. Yes. So the people who have been through it, listen to those people, and you'll see it's not worth, this too shall pass. This is not worth panicking over. But if you're going to work in industries, let's just say if you're going to breathe air on planet Earth, you need to gain skill sets to learn how to manage your stress. That nobody can avoid that. If you're not willing to put some effort into learning how to manage your stress, you will be stressed all the time. You will feel out of control. You will feel victimized. You will feel hard done by. You'll sound like a whiner. People won't want to be around you because you're whining all the time. So it all comes down to your attitude and the choices that you make.
Yes.
That's my theory, which is mine. There will be other people who will argue with me.
I completely agree. And I think misery loves company. And I think if you're in an environment, I like the fact that you talked about like those that have been doing it for a long time and just the guidance that they'll share, because I'm a huge believer in mentors, and I'm a huge believer in allowing your brain to be a sponge to the right information and really monitor. I think right now is a perfect time and a perfect example of just professional drivers have gone through a lot for the last 2 years. And right now is just kind of almost a cherry on the cake, where you really need to look at who's giving you the advice, because it's easy for, if we want to talk about trucking companies, for the safety guy to preach all these things, but yet he sneezes and he doesn't wash his hands after. Now you got to watch that, but also who's living in doom and gloom and who's living in opportunity. So that way, you're not bottling it up and you're not all day, every day, you're just talking to people who are equally or more stressed than you and have all these negative things to say. I think it's just wearing like too many jackets in the summer day. Like you're just going to be like freaking yourself out. But I really agree with what you said and it really aligned. And it's funny when you're talking about attitude, and it made me think of we started in grade 8 basketball coach, where he would be screaming at us, attitude's everything, when we're crying because our legs were so sore from all these drills. And it's really no different to today, where you have to go through emotions, but yeah, you can't control every environment you're in, but you can control your attitude and how you respond to it. So I think you're absolutely right. I really appreciate that definition.
And you can work on gaining skill sets, like be better, work harder, read more, listen more, especially to somebody that's got hours in a day in a vehicle that can listen to podcasts, that can listen to the great classic books, that some of which are available for free or next to free through YouTube. I listen to YouTube in my car all the time. It costs nothing. So there are skill sets out there that people have bothered to take the time to talk to the experts, to write down the strategies and techniques, and you can learn them and it costs you nothing. And I really strongly encourage everybody should do that. Anybody who hasn't invested time in doing that should not be whining about how stressed they are.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so how about those that refuse? Those that say, nope, I like being stressed. I like being negative.
Oh my God. Spend as little time near those people as you can possibly spend. Really, they are contagious. They are contagious. As a matter of fact, this is a great vehicular analogy. In Carnegie, we used to still do refer to certain people as BMW drivers. BMW, don't drive the BMW. Have you ever heard that phrase?
No.
I'm sure BMW isn't thrilled that
they're not sponsoring this episode, so we're okay.
That would add to your stress. Don't drive the BMW and don't hang out with BMW drivers. BMW is shorthand for bitching, moaning, and whining.
Okay, yes.
Don't drive the BMW. And so if you are in a professional situation, like I've seen this with my eyes on many occasions in the lunchroom, where there's a table full of people and they are consumed with driving the BMW. I would walk into the room and they'd be BMing and Wing, and I can only stand there for a limited number of minutes. I can't listen to them anymore. It's like, oh my God, I got work to do. That was actually one of my favorite common phrases was, I'd love to stay here and whine. I got work to do. That made me really popular. So in a class, I would frequently have students stand up and say, I was in a room last night with the BMW drivers, or I got stuck with a bunch of BMW drivers. And I asked a class one year, could you try to quantify how much time around you people are spending, pick one person or just pick your work situation, how much time people are investing in driving the BMW. For example, if I walked into a federal government lunchroom and there were 8 people there and they spent an hour whining, that's an 8-hour workday of people bitching, moaning, and whining. That's a phenomenal waste of time. It's a phenomenal waste of time. And it makes everybody feel worse when they leave. It's like, why try? Why bother? Why try? So driving the BMW is contagious. It affects everybody around you. It becomes a really bad habit for you personally, because you will confuse yourself. You'll persuade yourself that you did something about the situation because you whined about it for an hour, right? Well, I whined about it for an hour. That was what I did. That was my contribution. So you can rationalize the time to yourself because you, rather than keep it to yourself, you shared it with other human beings. When in fact, you've probably made the situation worse, certainly moved nobody toward any improved situation. So driving the BMW yourself, you should stop doing that right now. Just stop doing it. I'll give you a little tool technique to help you do that. And if you're hanging out with BMW drivers, you need to stop hanging out with them. Like stop, go find more positive people to be around. I'll pause for a second and see if you want to comment on that. But I also have a tip for BMW drivers that you can't get away from.
Well, that was going to be my next question is what if you're in an environment where you can't? But I think so when I was initially welcoming you onto the podcast, I mentioned the fact that you're factual and your advocacy is backed by like actual information and it's not just fluff. And I think a lot of times when people whine, you see it on social media, like I have to literally stay off certain platforms right now because it's too much. Yeah. And you're like, no, that's not advocacy. That's whining. Like that's like trying to kick a massive rock and say, I'm getting this thing moved. It's like, no, you're not. You're just kicking rocks. So I think the fact that being aware and choice is obviously as humans, one of our best tools in our toolkit is you have a choice. And that's where I'm glad you're going next is what if you're in an environment where everyone's a negative Nancy, everyone's driving the BMW and no offense to any Nancy's, of course, but yeah, what advice could you share if you're in an environment where you can tell everyone is driving an 18-wheeler BMW and all of a sudden it's, okay, what do we do? Like, where do you take us from there?
In terms of if you're surrounded by BMW drivers that you cannot get away from, okay. I learned this tip in a de-escalation training program that was recommended to me by correctional officers when I worked in the Ontario's prison system in psych nurses. This was training put on for psych nurses, a de-escalation training on how you handle irrational people, right? Sometimes psych nurses and prison guards, they have to get a result out of a situation with people who are detached from rationality. That's a little bit stressful, right? So one of the verbal techniques that they need to learn how to do is to make a statement of non-concurrence. Make a statement of non-concurrence. That's actually verbally saying, I hear everything that you're saying, Josh. I just can't agree with that. I just can't go there with you. I don't think that that's a correct a fact. I don't think that's factual. I don't agree with that. So that's called making a statement of non-concurrence. I'll give you an example of a real life situation where it's really important to be able to make a statement of non-concurrence, right? Which for you, as the only person in the situation who doesn't want to spend the day driving the BMW, you need to signal to the people around you, I will not be part of this. I will not be part of this, right? So I remember talking to a cop once who was trying to calm down an inebriated person. I'm sorry, not the cop, the nurse. Somebody from the hospital was outside the hospital trying to calm down an inebriated person. The police were arriving, police cars were arriving, and the inebriated person, whether they were on drugs or alcohol, I'm not sure, thought it was a good idea to throw sharp metal objects at the police officers. Might have been a scissors.
Wow.
Yeah. And the nurse was saying, I don't think it's a good idea to throw things at police officers. Wow. That's a perfect statement of non-concurrence, right? That's not insulting the person who needs care. That's not calling them stupid or saying what kind of lame brain idea is that, or you're going to get yourself killed, but a really good, clear statement of non-concurrence. I don't think you should be throwing things at police officers. That could save that person's life, you know? Yes. Like the cops could, like it has happened. It has happened where a man was actually shot by cops because he had a scissors in his hand and they didn't know what it was, you know? So I find in both business and personal situations, when I cannot join in or I refuse to join in on a conversation, a BMW driving conversation, just a statement of non-concurrence, which lets everybody know I do not concur, right? I will not be part of this conversation. Usually gets me off the hook. Like they go, oh, well, there's no point in sharing all this with Rita. She's gonna actually break up the party with some facts. So they let me go, or they stop talking, or they change the topic or whatever. My favorite government line, like I'd love to stay and wine with you, but I got work to do. It's kind of a statement of non-concurrence in its own way. But having the guts to actually say, no, I don't agree with this, what you're saying, and I'm going to move on to something else, is important to be able to do. And you can get good at it. You can find the language that seems to suit you and doesn't offend needlessly, overly so, offend the people around you. And another good phrase I learned from that same session on de-escalation training that follows up the statement of non-concurrence. If the person is not calming down, the person is continuing to rant or rave or say nonsensical things or be insulting or whatever, what a professional will do in that situation is say, I'll come back later when you're calmer. Mm-hmm. I'll come back later when you're calmer. Sometimes I've actually said to family members, I'll come back later when you're rational, but what that signals is that there is just no purpose to continuing that conversation with the person who their goal is to keep you in the painful conversation. That's their goal. Yes. That keeping you in the conversation is its own reward. And you don't want to reward people who are just trying to torture you with their whining. And so when you can say, I don't agree, and I'll come back later when we're both calmer. I'll come back later when we've got time to think. Let's continue this conversation later. Yes. So that's in terms of being around negative people. This isn't being around border guards that are enforcing the law, right? This is being around negative people who want to loop you into their BMW driving. How do you get away from it? Well, there's two tips you could use.
Perfect. Yeah. And I think that's really important because you're also, I often talk about leading with empathy. And I think that's the power of empathy is you don't always have to agree, but you can acknowledge that you're hearing. And if you're saying, let's talk about this later. And no, I'm not going to engage in this type of a conversation. Then you're standing up for your own well-being. Yeah. It's setting a good precedent to that individual for two things. And it's not always the case. This is just my interpretation through life is a lot of times after the fact, they're not going to, if I can use the word complain, whine, I don't normally swear, but I'll say bitch to you. They're not going to do it anymore.
Sometimes to be more polite, we say bellyache. Moan.
There you go. That's a much safer word.
Beef and moan and whine.
But you're right though. And being in that environment, setting your boundaries, being empathetic, but also standing up for yourself, I think it's important. And I'm really glad you highlighted that because again, anyone that's scrolling social, a lot of I'm sure the conversations that are happening that I'm not involved in behind closed doors over a CB radio. There's a lot of, like I said, misery likes company. And I think, those are really important. So again, those that are listening, please do two things for me. First, as I mentioned initially, reach out to Rita if you have questions about things that she just suggested, those 2 points, but also apply it. So if that means you have to listen to this 10 times before it actually sinks in, that's perfect. I do that all the time because ultimately your mental health matters way more than any other experience that you're going to navigate through during today's stressful time where like if you feel like a sack of potatoes and everything's Debbie Downer, really, what are you doing for yourself and your family? Why are you working this hard when ultimately you're trying to provide a better life for your family so you can obviously take part in protecting your mental health? So I appreciate that. But you also mentioned Dale Carnegie a couple of times. And I remember when you first, we were chatting and you mentioned him, I was like I literally, when we were done talking, I ran over to where my wife, her little office is in her house here. And I was like, you'll never guess why. You'll never get, I just got so stoked because in this space, in our industry, people that are investing time and money into different types of training through Dale Carnegie, through Bob Burge, Zig Ziglar, I find that to be rare. And lots of times I'll ask, oh, do you know so-and-so? And they'll be like, maybe. And I'm like, oh, what you just said really aligned with their way of thinking. So it's nice to know that you're a trained expert in this space. So when we're talking stress principles, is there a recap? I know we're going to dive more into future episodes into all of the stress principles, but is there a recap just for our listeners, as well as, is there a reference? Is it a website that people could go to? Maybe they wanted to pick up his book and we're talking in the realm of stress. And I guess it's a long question. So Dale Carnegie, where can people learn about the stress principles, as well as can you give us a quick recap of what are the stress principles? Are there more that we're going to obviously talk about?
Yeah, there's a couple of dozen of stress principles, all of which are contained in Honestly, Josh, you asked the question, I'm going to answer it. Contained in what I consider to be one of the greatest books ever written. And that book is How to Stop Worrying and Start Living. Most people know Dale Carnegie for his absolute classic, groundbreaking in 1936 how-to book, How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Yep.
That's what he's most famous for. It's still a fantastic book. The original, let's just go for one of the more recent copies of the book that are not updated for current jargon, like the Dale Carnegie for the Digital Age. I, as much as I love all the work that Carnegie does, I don't recommend that version of the book. Just go back to the original, How to Win Friends and Influence People. You can find it on Amazon. Okay. After he wrote How to Win Friends and Influence People, he continued to find in business that worry, what he called worry, what we would call today stress. He was on it more than half a century ago. He wrote How to Stop Worrying and How to Start Living, I believe in 1946. More than half a century ago, he was on top of the stress that people were enduring in their job was the most important thing that they came to talk to him about. The number of hospital beds that were taken up by people who were worried, stress, anxiety. The figures that we quote now today, he was on it. He was on it in 1950. Dale Carnegie was saying, he went to the New York Public Library to look for a book on worry. And when he went into the WO section of the card category, there was something like 184 books on worms and 5 books on worry. And he said, what kind of culture do we live in where there's, that many books on worms and none on worry? So he was really one of the groundbreaking people to identify worry and stress. And he did it in the most simple observational way. He talked to medical doctors and business people in the field. He didn't have anything near the wealth of information that's now available through all the mental health associations, the depression and anxiety research that's been done. But he noted it in 1946. So the books, How to Stop Worrying and Start Living, was so practical. It's so easy and pleasant to read. It's so applicable to the everyday life of every working person, every family person. If you're a human being alive on planet Earth, you've got stress, and Dale Carnegie was providing tips on how to deal with those stresses more than half a century ago. Still the best book in my mind, and I've read a few, still the best book on how to handle stress. And in the main, I will tell you what he was on was, it's your attitude. Your life is what your thoughts make it. He was telling us that in 1950, people should still be looking to him for that advice now. He was not about victimhood. He was not about whining. He was about get the facts, and don't make any, most confusion and worry, he says, is caused by people stewing around in confusion because they don't have the facts. Get the facts, right? Which is what you notice about me. That's the first thing that you highlight about me is that I'm factually based, right?
Yes.
So How to Stop Worrying and Start Living, the book, you can get it on Amazon. You can get it on Audible. I have it on Audible in case I need to refresh my memory. I'm sure that it's on YouTube. Somebody's probably posted it to YouTube illegally, but still, there's stress. You can buy a hardcover copy of the book. You can listen to the book. You can get the summary golden book for free. Dale Carnegie will send it to you. The Dale Carnegie organization in Canada will send you a golden book that has all the principles in it for free. So if you have never taken the time to train your brain and adjust your attitude to manage your stress, I would say the very first thing you need to read is Dale Carnegie's How to Stop Worrying and Start Living.
Perfect. Yeah, and I'll make sure to include the link to that book. There's no affiliate or not affiliate. There has to be affiliate fee or whatever like that. There's nothing like that. I just completely agree with Rita.
I'm not even an affiliate now myself. I haven't taught Dale Carnegie since I think 2014. So what's that, 8 years? And it's an interesting story of why I needed to take a breather from Dale Carnegie because of Uber entering the taxi industry.
Wow.
I had to tell my CEO at the time, I can do, this is I think a Seneca quote, a brave who hunts, a hunter who chases two rabbits will surely lose both.
Yes.
Right. And at that time, I was trying to teach and deliver Dale Carnegie. At the same time, I was trying to support the taxi industry when in Toronto, and I realized I could not do both. So I had to give up my territory in Dale Carnegie and stop teaching Dale Carnegie at that time. And the taxi industry in Toronto was full-time plus. I always feel I made the right decision, but I really do miss Carnegie some days. I really do miss it.
It's interesting how I like that mentality, or that quote that leads to the mentality, is you really do have to pick your rabbit.
I did.
And I think, again, your superpower is you're really, and I'm not trying to sound fluffy, but you're really good at allowing, how can I word it? You're really good at eliminating the victim mentality for others. And by doing so, you're really uplifting others to say, yeah, Rita's right. So I appreciate the fact that you were like, no, I'm going to take this on. And like you said, it's full-time plus. I know our industry's like that too. And like, I proudly work 100 hours a week, not necessarily always a job, but also just I'm reading these articles, or I'm going to write something, or I'm going to reach out to someone and just make sure they're okay, because like ultimately that's the pivotal impact that we're creating. And you're kicking butt, taking names with the pivotal impact too, where like that's one of our strong brands and slogans is you're actually allowing people to hear what you have to say. And because of the advice you're sharing, it's a redirect to the right decision. Perfect. That's a pivotal impact. So it's
when you say that I'm not like, I have no skin in the game to recommend Carnegie to people because I'm not professionally with Carnegie as an organization. I just love the principles and the realities, the philosophies and the advice and the help that Carnegie gave, and that Carnegie in Canada teaches right now so much that even though it's not professionally part of my life, it will always be philosophically part of my life.
Yes. And I think that's the power. I did a post a while ago and it was talking about the pages or the words on the pages started creating stories in my mind. And I think that's the power of what Carnegie teaches, because it's easy enough to read. You don't have to feel like you have to be a scientist to understand the formulas. It's, and then again, you read it, repetition, then you got to start acting on it. And the fact that, like, we can talk about this another time, but the impacts that this book has had on your own personal journey, I think that's how you can be such a great advocate, and it's ingrained in your muscles. It's muscle memory. I think that's the best part of his training. And again, there's others out there too that I highly respect, where I'm like, yeah. So I think our industry needs doses and doses of just not necessarily like over positive information, but just real, like, this is how you work through stress. This is how you navigate through a stressful situation that you can't get out of. And there's a lot of professional drivers that have kids at home, or their kids are about to go to university and they promise that they would help pay for the first year. Okay, well, there's sacrifice in anything, where I think just the tools and your strength, Rita, really does help those people navigate it. It's helped myself as a person over the last few weeks too. It's just super cool. So I like talking about legacy, and I like talking about it in a daily sense, not in a morbid sense, where we're really focused on the impacts that we're having on people. So when you're writing articles, or if you're reaching out to drivers to hear their stories, are you thinking subconsciously or consciously, what legacy and what impact am I leaving on this person in this conversation? Do you think about that?
Gosh, in exactly those words, good question. Let me think. My legacy. A former staffer of mine, a young man who's really smart and really good, we're still friends to this day, who worked for me in Ottawa many years ago. He called me once asking for advice. I thought this was, I wouldn't have ever thought anybody needed to hear these words. I thought it went without saying. But apparently it didn't. So if I was going to leave a legacy for myself, just for myself, not for any other human being, but just for me, if I was going to leave a legacy, it would be something like this. he called me and said, this was about 10 years, not even 10 years, maybe 10 years ago, 8 years ago, when social media was starting to become really the big thing, right? We're both writers, he and I. He was the press secretary and I was the director of communications. So both of us earned our living writing and proofreading, as he would point out. He called me up and he said, my boss wants me to take over our company's social media rollout, our social media campaigns plans. And I was wondering if you had any advice on what I should be thinking about for our social media strategy. And I said, well, I've had a blog since like 2004. Every time I sit down to write something, I try to answer these two questions. Is it interesting? And is it helpful? If it's interesting but not helpful, it's a bit of a time waster. If it's helpful but not interesting, nobody's ever going to see it. So is it interesting and is it helpful? If you say yes to both those questions, then maybe it's worth including in your social media. He said to me, that's brilliant. He said, nobody's mentioned that yet. Like, we're all talking about the links and the technology and the images and the approval processes, but interesting and helpful. Nobody's mentioned those words yet.
Yes.
So I guess, Josh, if they carve something on my headstone and I leave behind a legacy, if they carve, here lies Rita, she was helpful and interesting. Then is that a good legacy?
I honestly think you should get that tattooed on your left arm and your right arm.
helpful and interesting.
Wow. That's actually phenomenal, though, when I don't want to think about your tombstone, but that's really good advice because I struggle with that when I write, and I'm like, I've never heard that before. So
I really hope to promise everybody that visits Road Warrior News for information. That's why you would visit Road Warrior News, is for information. They find it helpful and interesting. If that was the case, then I would think that I was doing a good job.
Totally. Okay, well, that's a perfect segue then. So as we do come to a close, because we're approaching the hour mark, 53 minutes, I think. Yeah. And so where can people go? We talked about Road Warrior News throughout the conversation, and I really like it. I love the platform. So where do people go to visit, to learn and make sure that's helpful? And as well, is there any final thoughts that you wanted to share? Just as we come to an end.
Final thoughts. Are we dividing this into 2 hours, or is this it for this is it for this interview, and then the future will be the future?
The future will be the future. Absolutely. Okay. I think there's so many more from a principles perspective, but also from a driver mindset perspective. We talked about mental health perspective that I think I'm totally cool to commit weekly, monthly, whatever you want to do. And I think our listeners can agree that we need to have you back, that we can really dive into, okay, well, how do I navigate through this space? And we just put ourselves in those environments. So if we want to approach this, as we approach this end, if you want to keep that in mind, that would be fair.
Okay. I'll do that. We barely scratched the surface of stress and mental health, which I know we will be doing in the weeks ahead. So I'll have more information on that. In terms of contacting Road Warrior News, our email address is roadwarriornews@rogers.com. So that's just what it sounds like, with no dots or dashes or anything. roadwarriornews@rogers.com. The faster URL to use, because they both point to the exact same site, is taxinews.com. If you just type in taxinews.com, it'll take you to the exact same website. I guess you use the term advocate, in its broadest sense. And I do want to identify problems and issues and provide helpful information, be helpful and informative to people that need that. I am not a mental health professional, and I am not in any way, shape, or form someone that can deal with emergencies. So if we're talking about really urgent stress or mental health issues that don't just need interesting and helpful news articles, I would really want to make sure that people understand that they should be talking to a family doctor or dialing 911 or something like that. I don't want people to think I'm the kind of advocate that saves lives or talks, irrational people into putting down scissors. I'm not that person, right?
Yep.
I'm a writer.
Yes.
I visit the site, roadwarriornews.com or taxinews.com. Email me at roadwarriornews@rogers.com. And here's a really underutilized feature on the site. If I could just promote this, there's a search bar at the upper right-hand side of the website. It's right at the top of the page to the right of the news content. So if you are searching like border or taxi or Trudeau or the search bar is a really fast, good function. And I often people will say to me, I didn't know you wrote about that. I didn't know you covered that. I didn't know you had anything posted to that. I can't put everything on the front page of the website. Yeah. So by all means, use the search bar or look at the recent post column. Because there's, although you only see one page when you land on the site, there are now like 400 articles up, many of which might be helpful to people. So, and interesting, some of them are really funny. Some of my guest contributors are really funny, really talented people. And those are there too. So visit the site, use the search bar and email me at roadwarriornews@rogers.com.
Awesome. No, Rita, honestly, this entire conversation, leading up to the conversation, I was excited. And just throughout the conversation, you didn't let me down. So I appreciate that. Otherwise, I'd have to hit Control-Alt-Delete. Just kidding.
Oh, God, don't do that.
I'm just kidding. No, this was awesome. And I highly recommend people connect with you. Go to roadwarriorsnews.com, taxinews.com, and then obviously the email. All of the links, everything will be definitely included in the show notes as well. But I'm also super excited for the future. So, Rita, we talked about it briefly. We talked about it briefly at the end, but I think it's really important that we do discuss mental health, especially right now, because part of the term mental health, I used to get so frustrated because it was like a once a year event where it's like, let's talk about it, and then it goes away. And I think more and more people are starting to realize we can't navigate our current climate with that type of approach. There has to be consistent messaging, consistent conversations, but actual applicable advice. And you've shared incredible advice so far. So I'm really excited to talk about mental health from all perspectives. And then obviously we live in the realm of transportation, so we can navigate it through from an operational standpoint, from a professional driver standpoint, like what are people going through? And I'm really looking forward to those conversations because that's a huge driving force for this entire platform and what Truck Focus is about, because ultimately people need to know they matter and they need to know that resources are available when you're struggling. So I'm excited for, this future conversations, talking about obviously more of Dale Carnegie, but ultimately thank you so much just for hopping on today. This was a really great conversation.
Glad you found it helpful, Josh, and interesting.
Absolutely.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye. Rita, honestly, just so stoked on today's conversation. So I want to say thank you for just hopping on the podcast and for all the valuable information you shared. How we manage stress is a choice. And I'm grateful for the action steps that you shared to help us navigate through such stressful times as honestly our industry climate is today. As we prepare for future episodes, I give a shout out to all of our listeners and ask yourself, what is it that you would like Josh and Rita to discuss? And make sure you email me. So my email is in the show notes below. It's pbtlindustry@gmail.com. That way we can highlight it on a future episode. I highly recommend that you visit roadwarriornews.com, or you can email Rita directly at roadwarriornews@rogers.com. Rita, thank you so much again for hopping on the podcast. It just means the world. And I just really appreciate everything that you're doing. So to our listeners, before you leave, make sure that you like the episode, subscribe, and share it out. Let's get the word out that we can navigate through these stressful times, even if the stressful situation is out of our control, but how we respond to it is super important. And as Rita continuously shared, it's all in our minds. It's all a choice. So there's opportunity for us to do better. So thank you again for checking out the episode. And as always, let's create a pivotal impact. Bye.